In the winter of 1867, in a town called Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, a man walked out of the mountains carrying a sack of gold dust worth more money than most people in that town would see in a lifetime. His name was Josiah Kane, and he hadn't spoken to another human being in over 3 years. Before I tell you this story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your country, your state, your town in the comments below, because this story right here is going to hit different depending on where life has taken you. And if this story moves you the way it moved me, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let me tell you something. 3 years alone in the high country. 3 years talking to nobody but the wind and the wolves. He walked into Bitter Creek with a beard that touched his chest, eyes that looked like 2 chips of winter sky, and a heart so numb he wasn't sure it still worked. And the first thing he saw, the very first thing, was a girl sitting barefoot in the frozen mud outside the general store, shaking so hard her teeth sounded like a rattlesnake's tail. He stopped. He stared. And then Josiah Kane said 6 words that would destroy him, remake him, and haunt him for the rest of his natural life. He said, "How much? Can I buy you?" She looked up at him. This skinny, frostbitten, half-starved girl with dirt on her face and fire in her eyes, and she laughed. She laughed so hard she doubled over. She laughed like it was the funniest thing anyone had ever said to her. And Josiah Kane, the mountain man who had survived grizzlies and avalanches and 3 winters alone above the tree line, he never recovered from that laugh. Not ever. But to understand why, you need to hear the whole story. And I promise you, by the end, you won't be the same either. Josiah Kane wasn't born a mountain man. He was born a farmer's son in Missouri in 1839, the middle child of 5, raised on black soil and Baptist hymns and the understanding that a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands. His father, Ezekiel Kane, was a hard man but a fair one, the kind of man who'd whip you for lying but give his last meal to a stranger. His mother, Mary, was small and quiet and had a voice like cool water running over stones when she sang in the evenings. For the first 20 years of his life, Josiah believed the world made sense. You worked the land. You feared God. You married a good woman and raised your children to be decent. That was the contract. That was the deal life offered. And if you held up your end, life would hold up its end too. The war took that belief and burned it to ash. Josiah enlisted in 1861, same as every other young man in his county. He fought for the Union because his father told him slavery was a sin and the Union was right, and Josiah trusted his father the way he trusted sunrise. He marched south with a musket on his shoulder and righteousness in his chest, and within 6 months, he had seen things that no amount of Baptist hymns could wash away. He saw men blown apart at Shiloh, their bodies coming undone like wet paper. He saw a boy no older than 16 sitting against a fence post, holding his own intestines in his hands, asking for his mother with a voice so calm it didn't sound human. He saw a field after a battle where the dead lay so thick you couldn't walk without stepping on someone, and the sound your boots made, that wet, yielding sound, followed him into every dream he'd have for the rest of his life. By the time the war ended in 1865, Josiah Kane was 26 years old and something fundamental inside him had broken. Not cracked, broken. The peace that connected him to other people, the peace that let him believe in goodness and order and the basic decency of the world, that peace was gone. He went home to Missouri and found that his father had died of pneumonia during the winter of '64. His mother had followed 3 months later, people said of a broken heart, though Josiah suspected it was more practical than that. Probably influenza or malnutrition or simply the exhaustion of trying to run a farm alone while her sons were off killing and dying. 2 of his brothers never came back from the war. The youngest, Thomas, had gone west to California and nobody had heard from him since. The farm was overgrown. The house was rotting. There was nothing left. Josiah sold the land for $40 to a neighbor who probably cheated him, and he didn't care. He took that $40 and he started walking west. Not toward anything. Away from everything. Away from the graves he couldn't visit without screaming. Away from the neighbors who looked at him with pity or suspicion. Away from the entire machinery of human civilization, which, as far as Josiah Kane was concerned, had proven itself to be nothing but a factory for producing suffering. He drifted through Kansas, then into Colorado territory, taking odd jobs, ranch hand, freight hauler, buffalo skinner. Each job lasted a few weeks or months before the proximity to other people became unbearable. Not because they were cruel, because they were human, because they talked about normal things, weather and prices and whose daughter was getting married, and every normal word was like a blade scraping against the raw place inside him where his faith in the world used to live. In the autumn of 1864, Josiah walked into the Wind River Range in Wyoming Territory with a mule, a rifle, 6 steel traps, a sack of flour, a sack of salt, and no intention of ever coming back down. He built a cabin beside a creek at 9,000 feet. He trapped beaver and fox. He hunted elk and deer. He learned to read the weather by the color of the clouds and the behavior of the birds. He learned which plants could be eaten and which would kill you. He learned to tan hides and render fat and make candles from tallow. And for 3 years, Josiah Kane lived utterly, completely, magnificently alone. He spoke to no one. He saw no one. The only voices he heard were the wind in the pines, the creek over the rocks, and the wolves howling at night from the ridges above his cabin. At first, the solitude was relief. Then it became habit. Then it became something else. Something that felt like peace but might have been numbness, and Josiah wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. He panned gold from the creek almost by accident, noticing the flakes glinting in the gravel one afternoon. Over 3 years, working when he felt like it, he accumulated a leather sack of dust and small nuggets worth, by his rough estimation, somewhere around $2,000. Fortune. Enough to buy a ranch, a house, a whole new life. But Josiah didn't want a new life. He didn't want any life at all that involved other people. Then the winter of 1867 hit, and it hit like the fist of God. The blizzards came early that year, stacking snow against Josiah's cabin until the door wouldn't open. His mule died in December. Froze standing up one night, and he found it in the morning like a statue, its eyes glazed with ice. The creek froze solid and his traps were buried under 4 feet of snow. By January, he was eating bark soup and boiled leather, and he realized with grim clarity that if he didn't go down to a town and resupply, he was going to die up here. He wasn't sure he cared. But something, some stubborn animal reflex buried deeper than his despair, made him strap on his snowshoes, sling his gold over his shoulder, and start walking down the mountain. It took him 4 days to reach Bitter Creek. For days of wading through chest-deep snow, sleeping in holes he dug in snowbanks, eating nothing but a handful of dry jerky and handfuls of snow that made his teeth ache. By the time he stumbled into town, he looked like something the wilderness had chewed up and spit out. Gaunt, frost-burned, wild-eyed, his buckskin clothes stiff with grime and animal blood, his beard a tangled nest of ice crystals. Bitter Creek was not much of a town. A single muddy street lined with unpainted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a boarding house, a tiny church with a crooked steeple. Maybe 200 people lived there, most of them involved in cattle ranching or the modest mining operations in the foothills. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where a stranger was an event, and where a man who looked like Josiah Kane was a spectacle. He walked down the main street and people stopped to stare. A woman pulled her children inside. A man on the boardwalk put his hand on his pistol, not threatening exactly, but cautious. Josiah ignored them all. 3 years of solitude had stripped away whatever social instincts he'd once possessed. He didn't nod. He didn't tip his hat. He'd lost his hat somewhere on the mountain. He just walked, his snowshoes leaving strange tracks in the frozen mud. And then he saw her. She was sitting on the ground beside the steps of the general store, her back against a post, her knees drawn up to her chest. She had no coat. Her dress was thin cotton, gray with filth, torn at the hem and shoulder. Her feet were bare, and they were the color of raw meat, red and swollen and cracked. Her hair was dark and matted. Her face was thin to the point of skeletal, and her lips were blue. She was shaking, not shivering, shaking. The kind of violent, involuntary trembling that happens when the body is burning its last reserves of energy trying to stay alive. Josiah stopped. He stood there in the street and looked at her, and something shifted inside him. Not compassion exactly. He wasn't sure he was capable of that anymore. More like recognition. He knew what it looked like when a living thing was about to die. He'd seen it in the eyes of trapped animals, in the eyes of wounded soldiers, in the eyes of his mule the morning he'd found it frozen. This girl was dying. Right here, in front of a store full of provisions, in a town full of people, she was dying. And nobody was doing anything about it. He looked up and down the street. People were walking past her like she was a fence post. A man stepped over her legs to get to the store door. A woman glanced at her and then looked away, adjusting her bonnet as if the sight was merely an unpleasant distraction from her shopping. Something hot and unfamiliar stirred in Josiah's chest. Later, he would realize it was anger, the first real emotion he'd felt in 3 years. He walked up to the girl and stood over her. She didn't look up. He wasn't sure she was conscious. "Hey," he said. His voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Hey, girl." She looked up. Her eyes were brown, enormous in her wasted face, and they were not empty. That was the thing that caught him, that hooked into him like a fishhook and wouldn't let go. Her body was dying, but her eyes were blazing with something. Fury, maybe, or defiance, or just the sheer, stubborn refusal to stop existing. Josiah didn't know what to say. He hadn't had a real conversation in 3 years. The social machinery was rusted, broken. He wanted to help her, but the words that came out of his mouth were the words of a man who'd spent too long in a world where everything was transactional, where you traded pelts for flour and gold for supplies and labor, for survival. "How much?" he said. "Can I buy you?" The words hung in the frozen air between them. He meant, though he didn't know how to say it, "Can I buy you a meal? Can I buy you a coat? Can I buy you whatever it is you need to stop dying?" In his mountain-addled, socially atrophied brain, the question made perfect sense. Everything in the world had a price. She clearly needed something she couldn't afford. He had gold. Simple transaction. But that's not what it sounded like. And they both knew it. The girl stared at him for a long moment. And then she laughed. It wasn't a giggle or a chuckle. It was a full, explosive, incredulous laugh. The kind of laugh that comes from a place so deep and dark that it's either laughing or screaming. She laughed until tears ran down her dirty face. She laughed until she was coughing. She laughed until she had to press her forehead against her knees because she couldn't hold herself upright anymore. And Josiah stood there, his sack of gold over his shoulder, his face burning despite the cold, feeling something crack open inside his chest that he thought had been sealed shut forever. When she finally stopped laughing, or maybe when the laughing turned into something else, something closer to weeping, Josiah did the only thing he could think of. He took off his buckskin coat, the one lined with beaver fur that he'd stitched himself over long winter nights by firelight, and he dropped it over her shoulders. Then he walked into the general store and bought every piece of food he could carry. He came out with a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a tin of sardines, a bag of dried apples, and a jar of honey. He set it all down in front of her like an offering at an altar he didn't understand. Then he sat down on the frozen ground beside her, because standing over her felt wrong, and he waited. She ate, not greedily, though she must have been starving, carefully, methodically, like someone who'd learned that eating too fast when you're that hungry can kill you just as dead as not eating at all. She tore the bread into small pieces and chewed each one thoroughly. She ate 3 sardines and wrapped the rest in a piece of cloth she pulled from somewhere inside her dress. She sipped the honey straight from the jar, closing her eyes as the sweetness hit her tongue. When she'd eaten enough to have some color back in her face, she looked at him sideways and said, "You can't buy a person, you know." "I know," Josiah said, though in truth, he'd seen it done. In the war. In Missouri before the war. The world was full of buying and selling people, and it was one of the reasons he'd left it. "My name is Lila," she said. "Lila Dunn. And I'm not for sale. Josiah Kane. I wasn't trying to buy you. I was trying to—" He stopped. He genuinely didn't know how to finish the sentence. Help? Save? Fix? None of those words felt right. "I don't talk to people much," he finally said. "I noticed," she said. and there was a ghost of a smile on her cracked lips. Over the next hour, sitting on the frozen ground outside the general store while the people of Bitter Creek gave them a wide berth, the wild mountain man and the homeless girl, two creatures that decent society preferred not to acknowledge. Lila told Josiah her story. She was 19 years old. She'd been born in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher named Robert Dunn and his wife, Catherine. Her father had been a gentle, bookish man who believed in education, equality, and the fundamental goodness of human beings. He'd been an abolitionist before the war and had helped escaped slaves through the Underground Railroad, hiding them in the root cellar beneath their house. After the war, Robert Dunn had caught the Western fever like so many others. He'd read about the opportunities in the territories. Free land, fresh starts, gold in the streams and silver in the hills. He'd packed up his family, Lila, her mother, and her younger brother, Samuel, who was 12, and joined a wagon train heading west in the spring of 1866. The journey had been brutal. Her mother had taken sick somewhere in Nebraska Territory, cholera, most likely from bad water, and had died within 3 days. They'd buried her beside the trail under a pile of rocks because the ground was too hard to dig a proper grave, and Lila had watched her father age 10 years in a single afternoon. But Robert Dunn pressed on because there was nothing to go back to, and because he believed, with the unshakable faith of a man who'd spent his life in books, that things would get better. They always got better. That was what history taught, wasn't it? Progress. Improvement. The arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. The wagon train reached Wyoming Territory in late summer. Robert Dunn filed a homestead claim on a quarter section of land near Bitter Creek and started building a soddy, a house made of stacked blocks of prairie sod, the only building material available on the treeless plains. He was a schoolteacher, not a farmer or a builder, and the soddy was a miserable thing. Dark, damp, infested with insects and snakes that burrowed through the earth walls. But they survived the autumn. Robert started a small school in town, teaching the children of ranchers and miners. Samuel helped on the homestead, learning to handle the livestock. Lila kept house, cooked meals, tended a small garden. For a few months, it seemed like Robert Dunn's faith might be justified. Things were getting better. Then winter came, the same winter that had driven Josiah off his mountain. The winter of 1867, which old-timers in Wyoming would talk about for decades afterward. Blizzards that lasted for days. Temperatures so cold that trees split open with sounds like gunshots. Snow that buried entire houses, entire herds of cattle, entire lives. Robert Dunn went out one morning in January to check on their 2 milk cows. He didn't come back. Lila and Samuel waited a day, then 2, then 3. On the 4th day, Samuel went looking for his father. He found him 100 yards from the soddy, lying face down in a snowdrift. He'd gotten disoriented in the whiteout and walked in circles until he collapsed. He was frozen solid, his hand outstretched, reaching for a home he couldn't see. Samuel dragged his father's body back, and together he and Lila wrapped him in a blanket and put him in the lean-to beside the soddy because the ground was too frozen to bury him. And then, 2 weeks later, Samuel developed a cough that turned into pneumonia, and Lila watched her 12-year-old brother drown in his own lungs over the course of 5 days. Helpless, alone, unable to ride for help because the snow was too deep and the nearest town was 10 miles away. When the snow finally melted enough to travel, Lila walked to Bitter Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back. She was 17, orphaned, penniless, and so hollowed out by grief that she felt like a walking ghost. She'd been in Bitter Creek for nearly 2 years now. Surviving. That was the only word for it. Not living, surviving. Josiah listened to Lila's story without interrupting. When she finished, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that some things couldn't be fixed with words. Finally, Josiah said, "Where do you sleep?" "Wherever they let me," Lila said. "The livery stable sometimes, if Mr. Hooper's feeling generous. Behind the saloon, near the kitchen chimney, the wall stays warm. Sometimes the church, but Reverend Pratt doesn't like it. Says it encourages dependency." She said this last word with a bitterness that could have etched glass. And nobody in this town has taken you in? Given you work? Lila looked at him with those enormous brown eyes, and the expression in them was older than her years, older than the mountains, as old as injustice itself. I've been offered work, she said carefully, by men who wanted things I won't give. And the women in this town look at me like I'm a disease they might catch. Like being poor and orphaned is contagious. She pulled his buckskin coat tighter around her shoulders. There was a woman, Mrs. Harrigan, who runs the boarding house. She let me wash dishes for meals at first. Then she said her other boarders complained about having a vagrant around. Bad for business, she said. Made the place look disreputable. Lila's jaw tightened. I wasn't a vagrant. I was a homesteader's daughter whose family died. But once people decide what you actually are doesn't matter anymore. Josiah understood this more than he could express. He'd been a farmer's son, a soldier, a drifter, a mountain man. With each identity, people had looked at him and seen only the label, never the person underneath. In the mountains, it hadn't mattered because there was nobody to see him. But sitting here next to this girl, he felt the cruelty of it fresh, like a wound reopened. The sheriff? Josiah asked. Sheriff Briggs is a decent enough man when he's sober, which is about 3 days a month. He told me I couldn't sleep on the street because it violated some ordinance. I said, where should I sleep then? He said that wasn't his problem. She paused. He wasn't mean about it. That's almost worse. If he'd been mean, I could have hated him. But he was just tired. Tired of problems he couldn't solve. So he looked the other way, and I stayed out of sight as much as I could. Josiah felt that hot thing in his chest again, that anger, and it was growing. He looked up and down the street of Bitter Creek, at the closed doors and curtained windows, at the people who hurried past without glancing down, and he saw something he'd seen before. He'd seen it during the war when civilians turned their backs on columns of wounded soldiers. He'd seen it in Missouri when neighbors pretended not to notice the screams coming from a slave owner's property. The human capacity for willful blindness. The way decent people could step over a dying girl on their way to buy sugar and flour and feel nothing. Not because they were evil, but because feeling something would require them to do something, and doing something was inconvenient. He stood up. His knees cracked from the cold and from the years of living rough, and he extended his hand to Lila. She looked at it, this massive, scarred, weathered hand, and didn't take it. I'm not going anywhere with you, she said. I don't know you. Fair enough, he said. He thought for a moment. I'm going to buy supplies. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, a new coat and boots. I'm going to rent a room at the boarding house. And I'm going to rent a second room, for you. Separate. Your own door, your own key. No obligations. No transactions. I've got gold and nothing to spend it on. And you're freezing to death. That's all this is. Lila studied him for a long moment. Josiah could feel her measuring him, weighing him with a precision born of 2 years of having to judge, instantly and accurately, whether a man was safe or dangerous. It was the same skill a wild animal developed, the ability to read intent in a stranger's eyes. Why? She asked. Josiah didn't have a good answer. The truth was, he didn't fully understand it himself. An hour ago, he'd been a man who wanted nothing to do with the human race. Now he was standing in the cold, offering to help a girl he'd just met. And the feeling driving him was so unfamiliar it was almost frightening. Because you laughed, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 years. Something shifted in Lila's face. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The crack in the door. She took his hand and stood up. At the boarding house, Mrs. Harrigan, a stout, red-faced woman with the moral flexibility of a weathervane, was perfectly happy to rent 2 rooms once she saw the color of Josiah's gold dust. She gave Lila a look that was part disgust and part calculation, clearly wondering what arrangement was being purchased here, but she kept her thoughts to herself. Gold had a way of purchasing silence as effectively as it purchased rooms. Lila went upstairs to her room, and Josiah heard the lock click immediately. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening, and he heard something through the door that he hadn't expected. Not crying, not laughing, singing. Very softly, almost inaudibly, Lila was singing a hymn he recognized from his childhood, Amazing Grace. And her voice was like her mother's voice must have been, or like his own mother's voice, clear and sweet and unbearably human. Josiah went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands, and for the first time since Shiloh, he wept. The next morning, Josiah went to the general store and spent 3 hours buying supplies. Not just for himself, for Lila too. He bought her a wool coat, a pair of boots, 2 dresses, stockings, a warm shawl. He bought soap and a comb and a small hand mirror. He had no idea what a woman needed. He simply bought everything he could think of and had it all sent to the boarding house. When Lila came downstairs for breakfast, wearing her old torn dress because she hadn't yet found the parcels he'd left outside her door, she sat across from him in the dining room and said, "I need you to understand something, Josiah Kane. I will accept help, but I will not accept charity. Whatever you spend on me, I intend to pay back. Every cent." "With what?" he asked, not unkindly. "With work. I can read and write, my father taught me. I can do arithmetic. I can cook, sew, tend animals, keep accounts. I'm not helpless. I'm just—" She stopped, and her jaw worked for a moment before she could continue. "I'm just in a bad situation. There's a difference." "I know there is," Josiah said, and he meant it. He knew the difference between a broken person and a person in broken circumstances because he had been both, and they were not the same thing. Over the following days, something began to happen that neither of them expected or fully understood. They began to talk. Not about deep things at first, practical things. Josiah told her about his cabin on the mountain, the creek, the gold. Lila told him about her father's school, the books he'd carried west in the wagon, the way he'd read aloud to his children every night by firelight. But practical talk has a way of deepening when 2 lonely people are doing it, the way a creek cuts deeper into rock over time. Within a week, they were talking about the war, about loss, about the things they'd seen that they couldn't unsee. Josiah told her about Shiloh, about the boy holding his own guts. Lila told him about watching Samuel drown in his own lungs, about the sound of it, about how she still heard that sound in her sleep. They didn't comfort each other. That's important. They didn't say it'll be all right or time heals all wounds, or any of the other lies that well-meaning people tell. They just listened. And in the listening, something was exchanged that was more valuable than gold. The knowledge that another human being had seen the worst of the world and was still standing. The people of Bitter Creek watched this strange relationship with suspicion and fascination. Mrs. Harrigan gossiped relentlessly, telling anyone who would listen that the mountain man was keeping the homeless girl as his companion. A word she loaded with enough innuendo to sink a ship. The men in the saloon made crude jokes. The women at the church whispered behind their hymnals. But Josiah and Lila existed in their own world now, and the judgments of Bitter Creek bounced off them like bullets off granite. They had both been alone, truly alone in ways that most people never experience. And they had found each other, and the relief of that was so immense that the pettiness of small-town gossip couldn't touch it. 2 weeks after Josiah arrived in Bitter Creek, Lila knocked on his door one evening and said, "I have a business proposition." He opened the door. She was wearing the wool coat he'd bought her, and the boots, and she'd washed her hair and combed it back, and she looked, not beautiful exactly, but alive. Radiantly, defiantly alive. "My father's homestead claim is still valid," she said. 160 acres. The soddy is still there, damaged probably but reparable. There's good grassland and a spring that runs year-round. With your gold for supplies and livestock, and my knowledge of bookkeeping and education, we could build something real. A ranch. Maybe a school. Something that matters. Josiah stared at her. "You want to be partners?" "Business partners. Equal. 50-50. I draw up a proper agreement, legal and binding. We both sign. No charity. No transactions." She paused and looked him dead in the eye. "And no buying." Despite himself, Josiah almost smiled. It would have been the first time in 3 years. "Why would you want to partner with a man who doesn't know how to talk to people?" he asked. "Because you're the only person in this town who saw me," Lila said. "Everyone else looked at me and saw a vagrant, a nuisance, a problem. You looked at me and saw a person. That's rarer than gold, Josiah. That's rarer than anything. He said yes. Of course he said yes. What else could he say? She had offered him the one thing his mountain couldn't give him, a reason to come down. They rode out to the Dunn homestead on a cold March morning, on horses Josiah bought from the livery stable. The land was exactly as Lila had described it, rolling grassland with a good spring, sheltered from the worst winds by a line of low hills to the north. The soddy was damaged but standing, its roof partially caved in from the snow, its interior dark and damp and full of mice. And behind the soddy, in the lean-to, wrapped in a frozen blanket, were the remains of Robert Dunn. Lila had known they'd be there. She'd steeled herself for it. But when she saw the blanket, she went very still, and Josiah saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. "We need to bury him proper," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. They spent the rest of that day digging a grave. The ground was still partially frozen, and every shovelful was agony. But they took turns, and they didn't stop until the hole was deep enough. They buried Robert Dunn on a small rise overlooking the spring, and Lila read from the Bible, Psalm 23, and Josiah stood with his hat in his hands and listened and felt something moving inside him that he thought had died at Shiloh. They found Samuel's grave too, the one Lila had dug herself, with her bare hands, in the frozen ground behind the soddy 2 years before. She'd marked it with a wooden cross made from pieces of a broken chair. The cross was still standing, though it leaned now, battered by wind and weather. They straightened it, packed fresh earth around its base, and Lila placed a stone at its foot that she'd found by the spring. A smooth, round stone that fit perfectly in her palm. "He liked to skip stones," she said. "On the creek back in Ohio, he could get 12 skips. I never got more than 8. Josiah nodded. There was nothing to say to that. Some griefs are too private for words. They repaired the soddy over the next weeks. Josiah, for all his years alone, was a skilled builder. The mountain had taught him that. He shored up the walls, replaced the roof beams, packed fresh sod, and built a proper door with iron hinges bought in town. Lila scrubbed the interior until it was livable, hung curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, and organized their supplies with the meticulous precision of a woman who understood that waste could mean death. They bought cattle, a small herd of 12 plus a bull and 24 chickens and a plow and seed for a kitchen garden. Josiah built a corral and a chicken coop and a proper lean-to for the horses. Lila kept the books, recording every expenditure and projecting their income with the mathematical rigor her father had taught her. They worked from sunrise to sunset, and sometimes beyond. It was brutal, back-breaking labor, and there were days when Josiah's body ached so badly he could barely stand, and nights when Lila sat at the table with her head in her hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were trying to do. But they kept going, because what choice was there? The alternative was the street in Bitter Creek or the mountain above the tree line, different kinds of dying, both of them. This was something else. This was living with all its pain and exhaustion and uncertainty. And it was better. It was so much better. Word spread about the mountain man and the homeless girl building a ranch together. Some people laughed. Some people shook their heads. But a few people, a surprising few, came to help. Old Tom Whitaker, a retired cowhand with arthritis in every joint, rode out one morning and spent the day teaching Josiah how to brand cattle. A Shoshone woman named Rain Walker appeared at the soddy one afternoon with a basket of medicinal herbs and showed Lila how to make poultices for the blisters and cuts that covered both their hands. Even Sheriff Briggs rode out once, sober for a change, and sat on his horse looking at what they'd done with something like shame on his face. "I should have helped you, Miss Dunn," he said. "When you first came to town. I should have done something." "Yes," Lila said. "You should have." She didn't forgive him. Josiah noticed that and admired it. Forgiveness, he was learning, wasn't something you owed people. It was something you gave when it was earned, and Bitter Creek hadn't earned it yet. By summer, the ranch was operational. The cattle were grazing. The garden was growing. The soddy was warm and dry and clean, with a fire in the hearth and books on a shelf that Josiah had built from pine he'd hauled down from the foothills. Lila had started teaching. 3 children from neighboring homesteads came twice a week, and she taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic at the kitchen table, just as her father would have wanted. And Josiah Cain, the man who had run away from the world, found himself building a life in it again. Not because the world had changed. It hadn't. It was still brutal and unfair and full of people who would step over a dying girl to buy their groceries. But because Lila had shown him something he'd forgotten, that the world also contained people who would laugh in your face when you said something stupid, who would demand equality when you offered charity, who would refuse to be bought or sold or diminished. The world contained Lila Dunn. And that, Josiah decided, was enough. One evening in late August, Josiah and Lila sat on the porch of the soddy. They'd built a porch by then, with 2 rocking chairs Josiah had made from willow branches, and watched the sun go down over the grassland. The sky was orange and purple and gold, and the cattle were dark shapes moving slowly against the horizon. And the air smelled like sage and wildflowers and the particular sweetness of a Wyoming summer evening. "Can I ask you something?" Josiah said. "You can ask," Lila said. "Doesn't mean I'll answer. That day in town, when I said what I said, why did you laugh?" Lila rocked in her chair for a long moment, considering. Then she said, "Because it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in 2 years. Everyone else pretended I didn't exist. Or they offered me help with strings attached, with conditions, with expectations. You just walked up and said the thing out loud, the thing everyone was thinking but nobody would say. Can I buy you? That's what this whole world runs on, Josiah. Buying and selling people. You just didn't have the sense to dress it up in pretty words." She looked at him, and her eyes were warm with something he was only beginning to recognize. And it was so absurd. This giant, wild man coming out of the mountains with gold dust in his beard, asking a barefoot girl in the mud if he could purchase her, that the only sane response was to laugh. It was either laugh or give up entirely. And I'd already decided I wasn't going to give up. Josiah nodded slowly. "I'm glad you laughed," he said. "Why?" "Because it was the first human sound that made me feel something in 3 years. I'd forgotten what it sounded like. Someone being alive. Really alive. Not just surviving. You were starving and freezing and you laughed. And it was the most alive sound I'd ever heard." They sat in silence after that, rocking gently, watching the stars come out one by one over the vast Wyoming sky. 2 people who had been broken by the world, who had found each other in the mud and cold of Bitter Creek, who had built something from nothing. Not a fairy tale, not a romance novel, but a partnership, a friendship, a shared refusal to let the world win. Josiah never did recover from that laugh. Lila was right, it changed everything. It cracked open the sealed tomb inside his chest and let the air in, and once the air got in, things started growing again. Slowly, painfully, the way grass pushes through frozen ground in spring. He never went back to the mountain. He never needed to. The peace he'd been looking for up there in the solitude and the snow, it had never been on the mountain at all. It had been sitting barefoot in the mud outside a general store in Bitter Creek, waiting for someone to see her. Records from Bitter Creek show that the Cain Dunn Ranch operated successfully for over 30 years. Lila's school grew into a proper schoolhouse that served the entire county. Josiah became known not as the wild mountain man but as the quietest, most dependable rancher in Wyoming territory, a man of few words and absolute integrity. They were married in the spring of 1869, in the little church with the crooked steeple, and the only decoration was a bundle of wildflowers that Rain Walker brought from the hills. The ceremony was brief. Josiah said, "I do." Lila said, "I do." And somewhere, Robert Dunn and Samuel and Mary Cain and all the other ghosts that haunted them both smiled and let go and were at peace. Because that's what this story is really about, isn't it? Not gold or mountains or the Wild West. It's about the moment when one broken person sees another broken person and decides, not out of pity, not out of charity, not out of any transaction, but out of pure, stubborn, irrational humanity, decides that this stranger matters, that this life is worth saving, that the answer to the world's cruelty isn't to run away from it, but to sit down in the mud beside someone who's suffering and stay. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And remember, you are not for sale. You never were.